There seems to be a crisis in art across many popular mediums, where film and music is stuck on a repetition loop and nostalgia has replaced creative innovation. The internet has drastically changed how we create and consume art, with algorithms dictating our tastes for us and trends replacing authenticity. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the causes and symptoms of the creative rut that we seem to be in as a society, where the internet might take us despite its flaws, and how to move forward in terms of artistic and creative innovation. But to begin explaining what I mean when I say society is in a creative rut, I want to explore the commodification of the film industry. In Martin Scorsese's 2019 think piece in the New York Times on Marvel movies, he writes, "When the Hollywood studio system was alive and well, the tension between artists and the people who ran the business was constant and intense, but it was a productive tension that gave us some of the greatest films ever made. In the words of Bob Dylan, the best of them were heroic and visionary." Today, that tension is gone, and there are some in the business with absolute indifference to the very question of art and an attitude toward the history of cinema that is both dismissive and proprietary, a lethal combination. The situation, sadly, is that we now have two separate fields. There's worldwide audiovisual entertainment, and there's cinema. They still overlap from time to time, but that's become increasingly rare. And I fear that the financial dominance of one is being used to marginalize and even belittle the existence of the other. For anyone who dreams of making movies or who is just starting out, the situation at this moment is brutal and inhospitable to art, and the act of simply writing those words fills me with terrible sadness. Scorsese's comments naturally sparked a lot of controversy and backlash from hardcore Marvel fans, but I think the rest of us have definitely noticed that independent movies are hitting the big screen much less, and that everything is a remake and it's getting very stale and repetitive and formulaic, and that franchise has pretty much taken over independent cinema when it comes to pop culture. When Hollywood chooses which movies to produce now, they're not just focused on the movie itself, they're focused on toys and merchandise and theme parks, they're concerned with the global market, and they're more focused on a corporatized team to create palatable, widely consumed content rather than focusing on a singular creative vision. Franchises and sequels are more reliable financially and less risky when it comes to fitting a large studio audience. And as the film market globalizes, Hollywood has to heavily consider what China wants and what China will allow, because they have taken over as the top film industry in 2020. And they, of course, are very strict about censorship and what they allow their citizens to watch. Major motion pictures often make more money in China than the United States, and a 2020 PEN America report shows that Hollywood is consistently creating films with an eye for what China will want and will accept. And it's also been reported that China keeps expanding the topics and imagery it censors, as all authoritarian governments do. I think this is also a huge factor when it comes to the death of most film genres, such as the romantic comedy or the big blockbuster comedy. The last one we had of that was The Hangover in 2009, and it's because China is very strict about what they accept. And because people are making so much money in China, that's who they're trying to appease. And then, of course, we have this whole woke phenomenon that's been going on for the past decade, and a lot of comedy nowadays won't fly because we're in a very serious time period. It's crazy watching old romantic comedies because it's all just so lighthearted and nice, as you'd expect from a movie like that. But nowadays, I feel like everything is so strict and so serious, there isn't any lightheartedness, and not even in the art either, like not within people and not within art, and it's kind of upsetting and sad to see. And the other sad aspect about all these genres dying is that it also kills all the great satires that come out, thinking about Scary Movie, Not Another Teenage Movie, Tropic Thunder. Since there's no more genres to satirize, there's no more satire. There's nothing left to parody, and it's sad. But movie franchises that are mostly action sequences and CGI effects and very simple stories and little dialogue is very easy to translate for the global market. And of course, it's what kids like. If you ever look at the content that like kids watch on YouTube, it's just in your face, flashing lights, always sound, there's never any break for anything. You don't have to think at all when you watch it. And of course, I'm going to talk about content more in the internet section because that plays a huge role in all of this. Everything is just seen and produced as content. But basically, action and superhero movies aren't dependent on American context, so it doesn't have to be nuanced. You don't have to live in America to understand it. It's very palatable for a wide-scale audience. And when it comes to censorship as well, Disney Plus recently has been censoring a lot more of their content, even on the American version of their streaming website. And the concern that this raises for me, besides the fact that these soulless corporations are valuing blood money from authoritarian governments with ongoing human rights abuses, which should not be a surprise for anyone because profit matters more than artistic and moral integrity these days, is how much the censorship will affect everyone else in countries that are supposed to have freedom of expression. As we become more and more of a corporatocracy, art is held to the confines of large streaming platforms and these sort of monopolistic, oligarchic corporations that decide what gets put out, what gets censored or not, and filmmakers are increasingly not only having to fit the standards of what Hollywood executives want, but what China wants and what the global market wants and what authoritarian governments want. But to finish off this section, I wanted to read a comment that I saw on the New York Times piece that Martin Scorsese wrote after scrolling through all the outraged Marvel fans. Someone had this to say, which I think a lot of people can relate to. I feel exactly the same way Scorsese does about modern pop music. Soulless, computerized, non-melodic, vapid, and immature. There was a time in the 60s and 70s, and well into the 80s and even the 90s, when pop music was an art form. It was thought of as an art form both by the consumers and the artists. The public valued and expected good musicianship and songwriting. Real music performed with emotion and feeling. Flipping the dials across the radio spectrum today is nothing but a vast wasteland of digital trap beats and sound effects with monotone vocals over the top. There is still some good music being made today, but just like the movie business, the cream no longer rises to the top. And I really wanted to emphasize the last sentence in that person's comment because that's my main criticism of where art is at right now. Obviously, I'm not saying that there is no creative or original art being produced. That's being produced all the time. It's the fact that the cream no longer rises to the top. Occasionally, independent art will hit the big screen or the mainstream, but more and more often than not, original art gaining pop culture reverence has become increasingly rare. There are plenty of studies showing that music is becoming more repetitive and formulaic, that there's less difference in chord progressions and so on than there used to be, and that most top 40 songs are written by 2 people. But just like everyone else, these record companies are just trying to make money, and repetitive and palatable beats are the easiest way to do that. And because commodified art is taking so much space on so many different digital platforms, it becomes harder and harder to sift through it and get to the good stuff. And before I talk about how the internet impacts all of this, I want to talk about nostalgia and why nostalgia is on the rise. It seems nostalgia has taken over the creative landscape, with constant remakes of old movies and franchises, and 80s music making a comeback in popular songs and albums, or in the case of Kate Bush hitting #1 again, actual songs of the 80s. And in terms of fashion and fashion trends, instead of the regular 20-year cycle, it seems like Gen Z is constantly bringing in everything that's ever existed in the past all at once. Y2K, 80s, 90s, 2010s even, that was like less than 10 years ago. But it's all coming back, and with streaming services like Netflix bringing in all these old shows from the 90s and 80s, it's very easy to just slip into nostalgia and just binge watch your way through the past. And to explain how nostalgia has replaced novelty, I want to explain the difference between repurposing and replica. And I guess I'll start with repurposing. And to me, repurposing means taking inspiration from things that are old, maybe even incorporating some older things into your work, but creating something new that has a very clear and direct creative and artistic vision that comes from within and hasn't been done before. If you think about the genre of hip-hop, they literally took old vinyls, physically altered them, put a beat over them, started rapping, and created an entirely new genre, while at the same time resurfacing and repurposing some older tracks to help them create something new. And this created an entirely new genre that 50 years later is the top genre today. And I could go off on a tangent too about how weird it is that there haven't been any new genres since then. Like, it's been 50 years and the only new genre I can think of that happened was the EDM and dubstep era, but that kind of came and went very quickly. But repurposed art can have elements of nostalgia in it, but it's very clearly something of its own. And I'd even put the e-girl and e-boy aesthetic into this, which is like a TikTok or Tumblr thing. It's a mix of emo, anime, and goth, but it has its very own distinctive style and aesthetic, while most other Gen Z fashion trends just seem to be replica. And what I mean by replica is trying to imitate something that already exists, which just leaves a hollowed out repetition in its place. This is happening a lot in music, from Doja Cat's Future Nostalgia to The Weeknd's Dawn FM to Haim or however you pronounce them. And these albums are fine, they're not bad, but they're not as good as the original thing that they're taking inspiration from. It sounds just like 80s music, but it doesn't have the same sort of spirit to it. Like, why would I want to listen to someone try to be Michael Jackson when I could just listen to Michael Jackson? And personally, I'd rather a piece of art be original and bad rather than a hollowed out replica and just be repetitive, like what Hollywood's trying to do with all their remakes by just taking old movies and replacing the leads with female characters. Who wants this? Nobody wants this? How is this still being done? If you want more diversity in film, just make new films with diverse characters. Why are you trying to change something that already exists? It just seems so hollow and like skin deep. And I can already hear like the Weeknd fans typing away on their keyboards, hating on me. It's not that the music's bad, but it's been done before and it's been done better. And I'm just tired of everything being nostalgic. Like, can't we have something new? But part of nostalgia is longing for simpler times, and given the fact that so many people see the future as very dark and grim, with climate catastrophe or AI taking over, it makes sense to try and cocoon yourself into the past, into simpler times, before the information age caused us to have content being shoved down our throat constantly, the never-ending stream of information, tragedy, and so on. We're constantly tuned in to everything going on in the world, and it's completely unnatural and not healthy, and it makes sense to try and go back to a time that seems simpler. And even though obviously the 80s were not simpler, there was the AIDS epidemic, there was Reagan, there was so much going on. In terms of movies and sound, there's still an element of fun, lightheartedness to it that we're not seeing anymore. And there's also so much consumption now that I think there's a lot less production on an individual level. It's much harder to be creative when you're constantly consuming. And a lot of production now is just a conglomeration of internet stuff. Like, we consume so much that we get sick and just regurgitate everything that we see and hear. And because pop culture has become so commodified, there is not as much stuff to go off of in terms of taking inspiration from the past. The past 10 years or so in popular media has been very shallow. And as they say, you can't really build a building on sand. If what you have before you is so hollow and shallow, you're gonna have to look back even further to take inspiration from things. But since you can't actually time travel back to the 80s and capture that spirit, that is not an online spirit, but the actual spirit of the people, it's impossible to make an authentic replica of that time. In the broader sense, though, futurists and academics have been talking about repetition and nostalgia as it relates to Western democracy as a whole. At the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama posted his famous essay, The End of History, where he speculates that at the end of the 20th century, because we had defeated fascism, and because the Berlin Wall fell and made basically communism not a viable alternative to capitalism or Western democracy, that the victory of liberal democracy left no other ideological alternatives standing, which resulted in a stagnation of art and history within our society, because since there's nothing to rally against and no way to expand, we just sort of stay in a stagnation until we start to decay. And he states in his essay, "In the post-historical period, there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history." Although he does end on an optimistic note, stating, "Perhaps this very prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started once again." And I also came across a YouTube comment on someone else's video expressing this similar sentiment, stating, "I think the reason 80s nostalgia seems to stick more than most nostalgic trends is that this was the beginning of neoliberalism. It wasn't the all-encompassing beast it is now. The Berlin Wall hadn't fallen yet. The future still held many possibilities. We weren't locked into this no alternative time loop quite yet. Almost like we were at a fork in the road that we constantly want to go back to, hoping that this time we can take another path." It's hard for people like me who weren't born back then and didn't live through the 80s to fully understand the cultural shift that happened when the Berlin Wall fell, and how this kind of did mark the end of Western expansionism and a lack of sort of political threat or foe for the United States and other Western democracies. But many have argued that because the expansive phase is over, which is typically the most creative and radical phase of civilization, that we have entered a state of decay and decadence, and that there is nowhere to go from here. Personally, though, I do think the internet will eventually change things, even if right now it's very hectic, and it honestly could go very many different ways. We could have full-on censorship of the internet could shut down, algorithms can completely take over. But before I do my section on the internet, I do want to know what you guys think about this end of history thing, and why you think our world is so nostalgic right now. But yeah, you don't have to comment if you don't want to, but it would be really cool because I'm really curious what you guys have to say. But now I'm going to move on to the internet, its promises, and how it's affecting art.
Further, I'm concerned about pictures. This is being suggested by algorithms. I know, I get involved with it too. The algorithms, they tell you all these things. You know, if you like that, you might enjoy this. And if you don't enjoy this right away, then there's something else, and something else after that. Actually, the usual end result of that, and it's happened to me, is pretty much is binge watching. So, and which isn't bad, it's just that, you go for one way, and the algorithm is dangerous because it takes away from your creative viewing. I think you have to make up your own mind about creative viewing. Now, look, I know the business has changed, and everything changes all the time. Impermanence, that's what it's about. It's wide open, though, now. You can watch everything, anytime, anywhere. And it puts a burden on you, on the viewer. You know, not all changes are all for the good, and I just feel that we might be tilting, if we're not careful, we might be tilting the the scales away from that creative viewing experience and away from movies as an art form. And we can't lose sight that it is an art form.
He also discusses the algorithm in a piece for Harper's Magazine in 2019, stating, "Algorithms, by definition, are based on calculations that treat the viewer as a consumer and nothing else. If further viewing is suggested by algorithms based on what you've already seen, and the suggestions are based only on subject matter or genre, then what does that do to the art of cinema?" The algorithm and the move from big theaters into streaming services, as well as Gen Z being chronically online, has all had an impact on the way that we create and consume art. It's had noticeable effects on the commodification of art, the creative rut that we're in, and the emphasis on nostalgia over novelty. People consume media differently now, and as I mentioned earlier with the superhero movies, everything now is very fast-paced and loud. It's designed to grab your attention and keep it. There's a lot less slow-paced cinema, I've noticed. There's less time to pause and sit and dwell within an emotion, even an uncomfortable emotion, and notice the subtle changes in a scene or in the emotions going on. And instead it's just content. It's just blaring content in your face. And before you can even pick something else, 3 seconds later, the algorithm's chosen something else and is auto-playing a new movie or a new show or something like that. And this is really affecting people's attention spans, and it's really affecting the patience that they have for movies. And if a movie can't have slowness in it, if it can't have a long build-up, then that takes away so much creative possibility in a piece of media. But I think the algorithm is killing creativity because its intense data collection is just bringing the same old things to the top and repetitive things to the top at the expense of original artwork. Because if you create something that's truly original, this data can't really connect it to other things that exist. It can't pair it as well, and it can't shove it down people's throats as well as, say, you watched one sitcom, here's another. You watch this horror movie, here's another. And this also makes the issue of remakes so much worse because the algorithm knows what the audience wants and it just gives it to you again. And it also prioritizes content that people like on the first watch versus a lot of movies. I'm sure everyone's had this experience where you go in and you experience it, and then as time goes on, you can't help thinking about it. It's still haunting you. That doesn't really happen as much anymore because you have to like something immediately, otherwise it's shoved to the bottom and it's not going to be seen by more people who might actually be affected by the work. And same with music. Sometimes you have to listen to an album 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 times to be able to appreciate it. And really great albums you can listen to indefinitely and they're always good. But now the focus, at least when it comes to record labels, is getting a really catchy beat that you can listen to 3 or 4 times before you get sick of and then shoving another one down your throat. And if you go back and revisit some of these, mainstream top 40 albums, they sound like trash. They sound like trash then and they sound like trash now because it's meant to be used and discarded as quickly as possible. And then besides the algorithms choosing what you consume for you, it's also choosing what you create. A lot of people have to create art with the algorithm in mind because they want people to see what they make, and for a lot of people want to make a living off of it. And so you have to kind of commodify your art so that way it's shareable on digital platforms. Visual art, for instance, has to look good on an iPhone screen. It has to look good on Instagram. So highly contrasted, simplistic images are going to do a lot better than a really high resolution photograph with a lot of intimate details that you can't see on a 4-inch screen. Physical art is flattened in the digital space and becomes a simulacrum of what the artist is trying to convey and get across. And as democratic as the internet is supposed to be, the algorithm basically functions to recommend the same content over and over again to the detriment of original work. The cream no longer rises to the top, as that New York Times commenter said. And then I think another reason for the vacuity in modern day pop culture is the fact that we don't really have a cohesive youth culture right now. The internet is so fragmented and there's so many sort of shallow subcultures because real subculture doesn't exist as much because that usually takes place in the physical world and there are certain sort of requirements you have to pass in order to get in. Gatekeeping can be a good thing. But because subculture is so fragmented and people could just choose an aesthetic one day and be something else the next, there isn't really any collective identity that we all share, which is crazy because we've gone through so much history recently. And when it comes to art and film with an authentic voice, we also have to deal with this ever-expanding narcissistic mob of people who want to cancel anything that makes them uncomfortable and shame other people for liking what they like, which I talk about in my Stop Moralizing Art video if you want to check that one out. And while the internet opens up endless options for independent artists, it also comes with a burden because now everyone has to brand and market themselves. There's not a record company doing it for you because they already have their 2 writers that write everything, and they already have their formulaic beats that they basically test out like fast food to see what's the most addictive. So if you want to reach people, you have to learn how to market and brand yourself, and that's an entire art form in and of itself. Concerns aside, however, I am still optimistic about the internet in the long run and what can be accomplished through this medium. Plenty of original artists have found success here and have reached great heights. It's also more accessible for a lot of people to make a living on the internet, creating art or selling on Etsy or doing whatever, than ever has been before. And more young people are able to find encouragement from other people, even on a small scale. And I think when you're first starting out in a creative endeavor, getting praise or encouragement from other people can really make or break you in terms of whether or not you want to continue. And it's also a lot easier to find people with similar interests and values to you, and to be able to connect with your audience on a peer-to-peer basis so they can actually tell you what they think about your art, their criticisms, and so on and so forth in order to make you better. And in the more traditional market, TV is kind of taking over movies at this point. And part of it is a financial reason. I mean, what is more profitable, a 40-hour Netflix series on the most recent scandal, or a 2-hour film that you have to like go watch in a theater? But because TV shows now only really have to cater to streaming services and not necessarily the global market, there is a lot more creative and innovative scripts coming out in the TV industry. There's way more scripts being written for TV every year now than film. And this doesn't mean that the new and creative ideas will always be popular, but the more scripts there are, the more chances of that happening, which is the other thing I like about the internet. Because the barrier to entry is so small, so many people can try things out on here that, yeah, you're gonna get more crap and bad art than you've ever seen before in your life. But there's also so many opportunities for something to take off that's genuinely good. And I'm an optimist when it comes to art. Maybe it's because I'm naive, but I do think that every human, or at least most of them, have some drive towards the transcendent that only really art or religious experience can bring to you. And I believe in the creative spirit of people, and I think we're more than our animal impulses. And I think the more depraved the culture becomes creatively and artistically, the more that craving is going to come about. And the more craving there is and the more demand, the more likely it is for actual original artwork to take place. And we could still see some kind of seismic shift in the territory. There could be really brand new genres and films and like new artistic mediums. There's a lot that can happen, you know? History is long. Civilizations come and go. Different cultures and tastes and mores come and go. I mean, anything can happen, really. But I don't think that this creative rut will last forever. And when it comes to bad art, only time can tell what holds up and is universal versus what is temporal and fleeting. I also think we're in the middle of a sort of renaissance period on the internet, where because everything that's old is on here, you can watch any old movie from like the 1940s and onwards, maybe even earlier, and all the different music and everything all exist on the internet now. I think part of the increase in nostalgia, as well as this weird schizophrenia when it comes to fashion and aesthetic of just trying everything all at once, and because people are finding all this old material, we're either going to run through it all till we've used it all and we're just so bored that we have to create something new, or something new is going to emerge from the ashes of all these other things, or just be repurposed and actually become better and just change as art does throughout history. But I do think right now, because everything is accessible for the first time ever, there's a lot of regurgitation and there's a lot of nostalgia and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. And who knows what's going to happen with the algorithms and the streaming services. That's probably the scariest part, the corporatocracy aspect, but only time will tell what will happen, and I'm very curious to hear you guys' thoughts on what you think the internet is going to bring in terms of artistic innovation. I also want to hear what kind of art you guys like what kind of independent artists have you guys been listening to lately or watching, what kind of movies you like. I mean, most of my favorite music and albums have been made in the last 20 years. There is still good art being made. The only thing is, it's really drastically gone down in the last 5 to 10 years or so. I feel like we're really steeply going into a rut, or in the middle of a rut, and I just want to get out soon. And when it comes to Renaissance too, I mean, the internet is basically how I discovered music, because I grew up only listening to Christian radio, which I hated. And then when I was in 6th grade or 7th, I discovered Metallica, Iron Maiden, Eminem, and my life was completely changed. I mean, it literally changed my life. I was never the same since then. And so I have a lot to thank the internet. I mean, that's how I find basically all of my music. And I could go on a whole tangent about Spotify, because it kind of does the same thing as the algorithm, but it is way more convenient than flipping through a bunch of vinyl if you're from the olden days and trying to find something that way, or how I used to do it, which is basically on YouTube, searching up things, borrowing friends' CDs, going on Reddit and trying to find different genres of music. Things are very accessible and easy these days, and it's interesting to think about what is going to come about from all of that. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Give a thumbs up. It helps me with the algorithm. And if you're subscribed to me, then that means I will see you in the next video. Bye.